May, 1543. A room in Frombork Castle fills with the thick, sweet smell of old age, sickness, and wax candles, mingled with the salty breath of the nearby Baltic Sea. On his deathbed lies an old man, a figure almost motionless beneath a heavy blanket. This is Nicolaus Copernicus. Outside this room, the world still revolves around the earth, obedient to the laws of Aristotle and the will of God. But here, in this quiet room, the center of the universe has shifted forever. His right side is paralyzed from a recent stroke. His eyes, which once peered sharply into the abyss of the night sky, are now clouded. Friends and students bring an object into the room, one still smelling of fresh printer's ink and glue. It is a book, his book, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. His life's work, the culmination of more than 30 years of silent calculations, secret doubts, and all-consuming fear. The old man's trembling fingers, barely obeying him, rest on the warm leather binding. He cannot read a single line. He cannot even focus his gaze on the complex diagram showing the sun at the center of the cosmos. But he feels its weight, the weight of a new world. In this single touch lies all the tragedy and grandeur of his destiny. He, who had stopped the sun and moved the earth, had done so in absolute silence, hiding his revolution from the world for an entire generation. He was afraid of ridicule, of the church's wrath, of the chaos his truth might unleash upon God's orderly world. And now, just as his creation finally saw the light, his own light was fading. The book was born, but its father was dying, never knowing if it would become the gospel of a new science or be burned on a pyre along with his memory. The central, dramatic paradox of his life had reached its climax. The man who gave humanity a new heaven could no longer see it. The main question hanging in the stale air of the room was simple and terrible. Why? Why did this titan of thought, who dared to challenge millennia, so panic fear the world that he waited until the very threshold of death to reveal his truth? The answer to that question was more complex than any of his astronomical tables. To understand the depth of Copernicus's fear, one must first understand the world he was about to shatter. Late 15th century Europe lived within a cozy and unshakable cosmic structure, crafted by the genius of Aristotle and brought to mathematical perfection by Claudius Ptolemy. This was not merely a scientific model. It was the foundation of a worldview, a pillar of faith, and the guarantor of social order. At the very center of this world, motionless and majestic, rested the earth, the stage upon which the great drama of human sin and salvation unfolded. Around it, in strict hierarchical order, nested on invisible crystal spheres, revolved the 7 celestial bodies: the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Higher still lay the sphere of fixed stars, and beyond it, the Empyrean, the abode of God and the angels. Every movement in the heavens was filled with meaning. Every planet influenced human destiny. Every comet was a divine omen. This universe was finite, comprehensible, and above all, anthropocentric. Man was the crown of creation, and the entire cosmos was built for him. To question the Earth's central position was not merely to correct an astronomical mistake. It meant knocking the cornerstone out from under the entire edifice of medieval civilization. It meant questioning the words of Holy Scripture, where Joshua commanded the sun to stand still, not the earth. It meant demoting humanity from God's favored child to a lost wanderer on a tiny speck, hurtling aimlessly through an infinite void. All philosophy, from the scholasticism of Thomas Aquinas to the daily superstitions of the common peasant, was saturated with this geocentric idea. It was in the sermons of priests, the lectures of university professors, in poetry and art. The world was a divine stage, and mankind was the lead actor. And into this world, convinced of its eternal righteousness, a man was born in 1473 who was destined to destroy it. Nicolaus Copernicus was not born in a vacuum, nor was he a rebel by nature. He was a product of his environment, flesh and blood of the very system he was fated to crush. He was born in the city of Torun, a prosperous Hanseatic port in Royal Prussia, to the family of a wealthy and respected merchant from Krakow. His heritage was a blend of German vigilance and Polish entrepreneurial spirit, a world of pragmatic traders and influential churchmen. The early death of his father, when Nicholas was only 10, became a turning point in his destiny. His maternal uncle, Łukasz Watzenrode, took him and his siblings into his care. This was a figure of titanic proportions, a brilliant diplomat, a tough politician, and most importantly, the Prince Bishop of Warmia. Watzenrode was a man of power, a man of the system. He saw in his nephew not a future dreamer gazing at the stars, but a future pillar of his own influence, a skilled administrator, and a canon. It was his uncle who paved Nicholas's path in life, sending him to receive the best education that money and influence could buy. Thus, from childhood, Copernicus was immersed in the world of church hierarchy, canon law, and administrative intrigue. He was not an outcast or a hermit. He was an insider, destined for the comfortable and honored position of canon at the Frombork Cathedral, a sinecure that provided a stable income and high social standing. This background is critical to understanding his 30-year silence. He did not want to destroy the world in which he occupied such a comfortable place. He did not aspire to the glory of a revolutionary, because he valued the peace and order of a respectable scholar and church official. His future had been mapped out by his uncle, to serve God and the bishop, to manage church lands, to participate in councils. In this worldview, there was no place for heretical theories capable of setting the entire Christian world ablaze. And that is precisely why, when doubt first stirred in his mind, it became not a source of pride, but a source of profound internal conflict and fear. He was loyal to the system, but his reason was leading him down a path that led inevitably to its destruction. However, the world around the young Copernicus was no longer monolithic and static. He lived in an era that would later be called the High Renaissance, a time of tectonic shifts in European consciousness. Old dogmas were cracking under the pressure of new discoveries and new ideas. This was not just an intellectual ferment, it was a global prophecy of coming change, felt everywhere. Just 19 years after Copernicus's birth, in 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing west in search of India, would stumble upon a new, unknown continent, forever changing the map of the world and the conception of its size. At the very same time in Italy, Leonardo da Vinci was dissecting human bodies to understand the mechanics of life and sketching designs for flying machines and submarines in his notebooks, pushing the boundaries of the possible. But perhaps the most powerful weapon of change had already been created: Johannes Gutenberg's printing press. Ideas that once took decades to spread, copied by hand in monastic scriptoriums, could now be reproduced by the thousands and cross Europe in weeks. Pamphlets, scientific treatises, ancient texts rediscovered by humanists. All this created a new intellectual environment. The human mind, long a submissive tool for interpreting sacred texts, now recognized itself as an independent force, capable of knowing the world through experience, observation, and mathematics. It was a time when interest in primary sources, in ancient philosophy in its undistorted form, was being reborn. Humanists called for reading Plato, Archimedes, and Ptolemy in the original, not in the retellings of medieval commentators. Copernicus, like a sponge, absorbed this spirit of the age. He belonged to the first generation of Europeans to see that the world was far larger, more complex, and more amazing than their ancestors had described. This feeling of a coming revolution was in the air. It gave courage to think differently, to ask questions that had been forbidden for centuries. And although this was not yet a direct challenge to church dogma, it created an atmosphere in which such a challenge became, in principle, possible. Copernicus would not have been Copernicus without Columbus, Gutenberg, and the humanists. They prepared the ground, creating the cultural humus from which his genius and his fear could grow. It was into this boiling intellectual environment that the young Nicholas plunged when his uncle, Bishop Watson-Rode, sent him to Italy in 1496 to complete his education. This journey became a true forge for his mind, the place where the diligent nephew of a bishop was hammered into a future revolutionary. He enrolled at the University of Bologna, one of the oldest and most prestigious in Europe, to study canon law, just as his uncle had planned. But his soul yearned for something else. In Bologna, he met the distinguished astronomer Domenico Novara and became his student and assistant. It was here, under the Italian sky, that he conducted his first joint observations and first sensed that the real movements of the planets did not quite fit into the elegant but cumbersome system of Ptolemy. He began to notice inconsistencies, the very small details in which, as they say, the devil resides. After Bologna, he continued his studies at the University of Padua, where he studied medicine. This gave him not only practical skills that he would use his entire life, but also taught him the method of precise observation and empirical analysis, an approach he would later apply to the heavens. But the most important event occurred in Ferrara, where he received his doctorate in canon law and where he, like many humanists of the time, dove headfirst into the study of ancient Greek. This was the key. Now he could read the ancient philosophers and astronomers in the original, without the distortions and interpretations of medieval authors. And in these texts, he discovered something astonishing. The idea of an immobile earth was not the only one in antiquity. He read in Plutarch and Cicero that Pythagoreans like Philolaus had suggested the earth's motion, and that Aristarchus of Samos, in the 3rd century BC, had proposed a complete heliocentric model. This discovery was a true revelation for him. It turned out he was not the first to doubt the obvious. The very thought of a moving earth ceased to be blasphemous heresy and became a subject for serious scientific debate, even if it had been forgotten for 1,500 years. Italy gave Copernicus not only knowledge but also intellectual courage. It showed him that alternative ways of thinking existed, that the authority of the ancients was not absolute, and that the only judge in science is logic, mathematics, and observation. He returned to Poland a different man. A seed of doubt had been planted in his mind, which, in the silence of his Frombork Tower, would grow into a new universe. Returning to his homeland in Warmia around 1503, Copernicus began his duties as a canon. But the Italian seed of doubt had already begun to sprout in his mind. Over the next decade, in the intervals between administrative work, diplomatic missions, and medical practice, he continued his reflections and calculations. The result of this first, most daring phase of his work was a small manuscript known as the Commentariolus, or Little Commentary. Historians estimate it was written around 1514. This document is the true genetic code of the coming revolution. On just a few pages, without complex mathematical proofs, Copernicus laid out the 7 axioms of his new cosmology. He asserted that there is no single center for all celestial orbits, that the center of the Earth is not the center of the universe, but only the center of gravity and the lunar orbit, that all spheres revolve around the Sun as their central point, and therefore the Sun is the center of the universe, and most importantly, that the Earth has several motions, including a daily rotation on its axis and an annual revolution around the Sun. It was a thunderclap from a clear sky, but it was a thunderclap no one heard. Copernicus did not send his manuscript to be printed. He did not even sign it with his name. He merely made a few copies and distributed them among a very narrow circle of his closest friends and fellow astronomers whom he trusted. This was his first decisive step, and simultaneously his first great act of concealment. Like a cautious swimmer, he had only dipped a toe in the water to test its temperature, and apparently, feeling its icy chill, he pulled his hand back. The reaction to the commentary, even within this small circle, likely showed him just how radical and unacceptable his idea was to his contemporaries. He realized that to be heard, he needed not just bold theses, but irrefutable mathematical proofs capable of surpassing Ptolemy's system in their precision. And so he fell silent. He retreated to his tower in Frombork to dedicate the next 30 years to creating the monumental work that could prove him right. The Little Commentary became his secret, his manifesto that he showed to the world and immediately hid. This event is the key to understanding his paradox. He already understood, at the very beginning of his journey, the full danger of his undertaking and chose a strategy of long, meticulous, and secret accumulation of strength. To understand why a man who possessed such a revolutionary idea chose the path of a 30-year silence, one must look into the very core of his personality, into his inner world, which was not that of a fiery orator, but rather that of a perfectionist artist or a theologian seeking God in the harmony of numbers. Copernicus's main driving force was not a thirst for fame or a desire to refute authorities. His secret, almost obsessive passion was a thirst for aesthetic and mathematical perfection. When he looked at the accepted Ptolemaic model, he saw not so much a scientific error as an intellectual ugliness. To explain the apparent non-uniform motion of the planets, Ptolemy's system had to resort to cumbersome and artificial constructs, epicycles, circles whose centers move on other circles, deferents, and equants, points from which the motion of the epicycle's center appears uniform. This system worked. It allowed for predicting the positions of the planets with acceptable accuracy. But at what cost? It was monstrously complex, asymmetrical, and lacked internal elegance. In the preface to his main work, Copernicus would later write that his predecessors, in trying to explain the universe, were like an artist who, taking hands, feet, a head, and other limbs from different models, would paint them in such a way that the result would be a monster rather than a man. It was this feeling of monstrosity that pushed him to seek an alternative. He was convinced that the Creator, being a perfect architect, could not have created such a clumsy and illogical mechanism. The universe had to be simple, harmonious, and elegant. His heliocentric model was not just more accurate to him, it was, above all, more beautiful. By placing the Sun at the center, he could explain the retrograde motion of the planets as a simple combination of the Earth's motion and the planet's own motion, eliminating the need for Ptolemy's most cumbersome constructs. It was a triumph of simplicity and symmetry. And this is precisely why he delayed publication for so long. His inner demon was perfectionism. He could not present his system to the world while it still had the slightest roughness, while its mathematical apparatus had not been polished to an absolute shine. He feared not so much the criticism of his idea, but the criticism of its imperfect execution. It was the fear of an artist afraid to show the world an unfinished masterpiece. And so, after his first trial run with the little commentary, Copernicus went into self-imposed exile in his tower in Frombork. This place, on the remote shore of the Baltic Sea, in foggy and cold Warmia, became his fortress and laboratory for the next 30 years. Here, he built his true strength. This strength was not measured in soldiers or florins. It consisted of patience, methodicalness, and an unbending intellectual will. His life turned into a strict ritual. By day, he was a respected canon, managing church lands, participating in chapter meetings, treating the sick, writing economic treatises. But as night fell, he ascended to his observatory in one of the fortress wall towers. His instruments were primitive, even for the time: a trichetrum for measuring the altitude of stars, a quadrant, an armillary sphere. Most of his work was not observation, but titanic, exhausting calculations, which he carried out by candlelight on paper. He rechecked the data of ancient astronomers, compared them with his own observations, and tried, step by step, to build a mathematical model of the universe that would be not only true, but also harmonious. He worked in complete solitude. He had no students, no colleagues with whom he could share his doubts and discoveries. His only interlocutor was the starry sky and the works of Ptolemy, which he was trying to surpass. Decade followed decade. He watched bishops change, wars wage with the Teutonic Order, and the Reformation split Europe apart. And he continued his calculations. This isolation both protected him and amplified his fears. He was far from the intellectual centers of Europe, which allowed him to work without interference or oversight. But this same isolation deprived him of feedback, support, and an understanding of how his ideas might be received. He was building his new world in a vacuum, and the more grandiose his creation became, the more terrifying it was to imagine the moment when he would have to open the doors of his tower and show it to a world that, as he well knew, was completely unprepared to accept it. His strength grew with every verified number, with every constructed table, but along with it grew the awareness of the abyss that separated him from the rest of humanity. While Copernicus was building a new universe in the silence of his tower, the world outside its walls was changing rapidly, and these changes made his future discovery more and more dangerous. In 1517, the German monk Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, setting the Reformation in motion. This event, occurring just a few years after Copernicus wrote his secret commentary, forever changed the geopolitical and religious landscape of Europe. The Christian world, which for centuries had been at least nominally united under the authority of the Pope in Rome, split into two warring camps. The Catholic Church, sensing a mortal threat to its authority and power, went on the counteroffensive. An era of religious wars, witch hunts, and the hardening of dogma began. Any dissent, any idea that could be interpreted as undermining the authority of the Church or Holy Scripture was now seen not as a subject for theological debate, but as an act of hostile subversion, as a heresy deserving the most severe punishment. The Inquisition, previously focused mainly on local sects, now transformed into a powerful punitive body. If popes in the Renaissance could afford to patronize humanists and listen with interest to new ideas, now, in the midst of a struggle for survival, this breadth of view was replaced by iron intolerance. Copernicus, being a canon of the Catholic Church, could not fail to understand the gravity of this change. His theory, which stripped the Earth of its central position, directly contradicted the literal interpretation of several passages in the Bible. In calmer times, this could have been explained away as allegory. But now, when Protestants were accusing Catholics of straying from the purity of Scripture, any assault on its literal word became deadly dangerous. Publishing his work was no longer just a risky scientific step. It had become potential political suicide. He risked being accused not only of scientific error, but of heresy by both Catholics and Protestants, who in their fundamentalism were often even more intolerant of such ideas. Thus, the longer he remained silent, the more dangerous the world around him became, and the more compelling his reasons for continued silence grew. In this atmosphere of growing danger, Copernicus's strategy, a long silence aimed at bringing his work to mathematical perfection, was simultaneously his tactical masterpiece and his greatest strategic error. On the one hand, it was the only correct path for a scholar of his temperament. He understood that to challenge a 1,500-year-old tradition, common sense, and religious dogma, one needed to have not just a hypothesis, but an impeccably functioning mathematical apparatus. His goal was not just to offer an alternative to Ptolemy, but to create a system that would work better, predict eclipses and planetary positions more accurately, and finally allow for the reform of the Julian calendar, which by then had noticeably drifted from the astronomical year. The decades spent on calculations allowed him to create the Prussian tables, which were intended to replace the outdated Alphonsine tables based on Ptolemy's model. He built his work like an impregnable fortress, where every numerical series, every diagram, was a meticulously fitted stone in the wall. He believed that if his mathematics were flawless, then philosophers and theologians would have to accept it. This was his tactical genius. He moved the argument from the realm of metaphysics to the realm of precise science, where he held the strongest position. However, on the other hand, this 30-year silence was a fatal strategic miscalculation. He waged his scientific war in complete isolation, while the enemy, the established geocentric paradigm, continued to control all universities, departments, and minds. He did not cultivate students. He did not form a scientific school. He did not prepare public opinion. He naively believed that the truth, once revealed in all its splendor, could defend itself. He underestimated the inertia of human thought and the power of institutional resistance. As a result, when his book finally came out, it was too complex for most of his contemporaries, and its author was already dead, unable to defend his ideas from criticism and distortion. His silence, intended to protect his creation, ultimately made it vulnerable. He won the tactical battle in his tower, creating a mathematical masterpiece, but he risked losing the strategic war for minds because he started it too late and completely alone. In this long and lonely confrontation with the entire world, Copernicus had extremely few allies and a huge number of potential enemies. His main and perhaps only true comrade over the years was his close friend, Tiedemann Giese. Giese, like Copernicus, was a highly educated humanist, but unlike the cautious astronomer, he possessed a more decisive character. As first the Bishop of Chełmno and later of Warmia, he commanded great authority and constantly, over decades, urged Copernicus to publish his great work. He did not fear the radicalism of his friends' ideas and believed in their truth. It was Gysi who became the moral compass and source of support that kept Copernicus from completely burying his work in his archives. But one voice of support was drowned out by a choir of potential condemnation. Copernicus's enemies were not so much specific individuals as entire institutions and strata of public consciousness. The chief enemy, of course, was common sense and the conservatism of the university environment. Aristotelian physics and Ptolemaic astronomy were the foundation of all university education. Thousands of professors across Europe built their careers on commenting on these systems. To admit Copernicus was right would mean admitting that their entire lives had been dedicated to studying and teaching a lie. It was an existential challenge they could not accept. An even more formidable enemy was the camp of religious fundamentalists, both Catholic and Protestant. And here, the enemy found a specific and very loud voice. Martin Luther, the leader of the Reformation, known for his harsh and direct style, upon hearing rumors of an astronomer who moves the earth, reacted with contemptuous ridicule. In one of his table talks, he declared, "People listen to an upstart astrologer who tries to show that the earth revolves, not the heavens or the firmament, the sun and the moon. This fool wishes to reverse the entire science of astronomy. But sacred scripture tells us that Joshua commanded the sun to stand still, and not the earth." This phrase, tossed off by one of the most influential men in Europe, was more terrifying than any papal edict. It turned Copernicus's theory into a joke, the whim of a madman, even before it was published. Copernicus certainly knew of this reaction, and it only strengthened his conviction that the world was not ready, and that premature publication would lead only to ridicule and disgrace. Nevertheless, despite Copernicus's self-isolation, rumors of his incredible theory slowly but surely leaked beyond his tower. And in 1533, an episode occurred that could have drastically changed his entire story. It was his missed chance, his great crossroads of fate. Johann Albrecht Widmanstätter, secretary to Pope Clement VII, a humanist and Orientalist who had somehow learned of Copernicus's ideas, likely through a copy of the Little Commentary, gave a lecture in the Vatican Gardens outlining the basics of the heliocentric system. The audience included the Pope himself and several cardinals, and the reaction was astonishing. Instead of anger and accusations of heresy, the theory aroused lively interest. Pope Clement VII, being a Renaissance man from the Medici family, was impressed by the novelty and audacity of the idea. Widmanstätter was rewarded for his lecture with a valuable Greek manuscript. Moreover, 3 years later, in 1536, Cardinal Nicolaus von Schönberg, one of the most respected and influential men in the Curia, wrote Copernicus a personal letter. In this letter, he not only praised the astronomer, but also strongly, in the most persuasive terms, begged him to publish his theory as soon as possible, promising his full support and assistance in disseminating the work. It was a unique moment in history. The very top of the Catholic Church, not yet fully frightened by the threat of the Reformation, was extending a hand to Copernicus and giving him the green light. This was his chance to present his work not as a challenge, but as a gift to the Church, as a tool for the calendar reform that had long been discussed. Anyone else in his place would have seized this opportunity. But Copernicus ignored it. He did not reply to the cardinal's letter. He did not send his manuscript to Rome. He retreated once again into the shadows. Why? Perhaps his perfectionism prevented him from showing a work that was not yet fully polished. Perhaps he distrusted the momentary goodwill of Rome, knowing how quickly moods in the Curia could change. Or perhaps his fear of the outside world had already become such a deep part of his nature that he simply could not force himself to take that step. Whatever the reason, the crossroads was passed, and the chance was lost. Such a favorable moment would never again present itself in his lifetime. The doors of the Vatican, briefly ajar, slammed shut, and the next time the heliocentric system became a topic of discussion in Rome, it would be at the trial of Galileo. By the end of the 1530s, Nicolaus Copernicus had reached the apex of his intellectual power. His monumental work on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres was essentially complete. All the key calculations were done, the tables compiled, the philosophical and cosmological conclusions formulated. In the silence of his tower, he possessed knowledge that no other person on the planet had. He knew how the solar system was truly structured. This was his peak, the moment of his greatest triumph. But it was a triumph known to no one but himself and, perhaps, his friend Goethe. And at this moment, he was likely possessed by a special kind of pride, the pride of a creator so confident in the perfection of his creation that he considers it above the vain judgment of his contemporaries. This was his moment of hubris, as the ancient Greeks would say. He may have believed that his work was so logically flawless, so mathematically elegant, that when it was finally revealed to the world, it would inevitably win over the minds of the best scholars, and the opinion of the crowd and ignorant clerics would no longer matter. He might have felt he didn't need the support of cardinals or the praise of the Pope, because his main ally was truth itself, the divine harmony written into the fabric of the cosmos. This conviction of his own rightness, reinforced by decades of solitary work, could have created an illusion of invulnerability. He was no longer just an astronomer. He had become a demiurge, creating a new universe on paper. And like any creator, he jealously guarded his child from the imperfect and hostile world. He postponed publication not only out of fear, but also out of pride, wishing to reveal to the world not just a hypothesis, but a finished, perfect, and irrefutable system. He was waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect circumstances, the perfect reader. But life does not provide perfect moments. This pride of the perfectionist, this faith in the self-sufficient power of pure reason, was his greatest weakness. He was challenging not so much God or the Church, but the very course of history, trying to single-handedly control the fate of his revolution. He was a king in his castle of paper and ink, but beyond its walls, time moved on, and the world was changing, becoming less and less receptive to the gift he had spent so long preparing. But time is a relentless adversary, and even in the secluded Tower of Frombork, its passage was felt. By the end of the 30s, Copernicus was already approaching 70. By 16th century standards, this was old age. His health began to fail him, and with physical ailments came the awareness of his own mortality. The first cracks began to appear in his seemingly unshakable resolve to remain silent. The main crack was fear, but no longer fear of the world, but fear of oblivion. The thought that he, having spent his entire life creating his greatest work, would take it with him to the grave, became unbearable. What would happen to his manuscript after his death? Would it be burned as heretical? Or would it simply rot in the chapter's archives, misunderstood and unread? This existential terror proved stronger than his fear of ridicule and persecution. To this internal pressure, external pressure was added. Despite his secrecy, rumors of the Sarmatian astronomer and his strange theory continued to circulate in Europe. But, as often happens with rumors, They distorted his idea beyond recognition, turning it into a caricature. He was portrayed as an eccentric who, merely out of a spirit of contradiction, had decided to swap the positions of the Earth and the Sun. His complex mathematical system, which was the heart of his work, remained unknown. He risked entering history not as a great scientist, but as the author of a curious and absurd hypothesis. These harbingers of the storm, his own aging and the distorted echo of his ideas, undermined his resolve. His tower was ceasing to be a safe refuge. It risked becoming his prison and his mausoleum. He was trapped in a cage of his own making. For 30 years, he had built walls of silence to protect his work, and now those same walls threatened to bury it forever. The atmosphere around him was thickening. He understood that his time to make a decision was running out. All that was needed was a push, some external event to force him to take the last, most terrifying step. And that event was not long in coming. Fate was already sending a man to him, one destined to be the midwife for his intellectual child. And this fateful act, this turning point of his entire life, occurred in May of 1539. One day, a young, energetic, and completely unexpected visitor appeared on the doorstep of Copernicus's house in Frombork. His name was Georg Joachim Rheticus. He was only 25 years old, and he was the complete opposite of the old, cautious, and solitary canon. Rheticus was a brilliant professor of mathematics and astronomy from the University of Wittenberg, the very citadel of Protestantism, the same place where Martin Luther, who had already mocked Copernicus's idea, taught. The very fact of this visit was an act of incredible bravery. A young Lutheran had embarked on a long and dangerous journey deep into Catholic Poland, to a remote province, to meet an unknown Catholic canon about whom there were only vague and contradictory rumors. What drove him? Intellectual curiosity, a thirst for new knowledge, and perhaps youthful audacity. He had heard of Copernicus's theory, and unlike Luther, did not dismiss it, but wanted to learn everything from the source. The arrival of Rheticus was a genuine shock to Copernicus. Into his closed and orderly world burst a representative of that very hostile outside world he so feared. But in Rheticus, he saw not an enemy, but an enthusiastic and, most importantly, competent listener. Rheticus was one of the few people in Europe capable of appreciating not only the philosophical audacity, but also the mathematical complexity of his work. He became, for Copernicus, the first and only true student, the apostle he had lacked all those years. Rheticus literally fell in love with the heliocentric system. He begged Copernicus to allow him to study the manuscript of On the Revolutions. The old astronomer, at first full of distrust, gradually yielded to the young professor's enthusiasm and sincere admiration. He allowed him not only to read it, but to make a copy. This moment became the point of no return. By letting Rheticus into his tower, Copernicus let in the entire rest of the world. His secret no longer belonged to him alone. The inertia of 30 years of silence was broken. The catalyst had entered the chemical solution, and the reaction became irreversible. The presence of Rheticus in the Frombork Tower finally made it possible to uncover and analyze all the layers of fear that had shackled Copernicus for 30 years. And the very first, most superficial, and perhaps most human of these fears was the fear of ridicule. In his future dedication of the book to Pope Paul III, Copernicus would be completely frank. He would write that he had hesitated for so long to publish, not from fear of the Church's anger, but because he feared that the novelty and contradiction to common sense of his teaching would provoke only laughter and contempt. He was afraid of being called a new Pythagoras, who, according to legend, was also mocked by his contemporaries for his strange ideas. This is the fear of the intellectual, the fear of the scholar who values his reputation among colleagues above all else. He understood perfectly well how absurd his theory must have seemed to a person of the 16th century. We do not feel the earth move. On the contrary, we see with our own eyes how the sun rises and sets, how it moves across the sky. We see how a stone thrown upward falls back to the same spot, not lagging behind a rotating planet. To say that it is actually us, along with the massive Earth, hurtling through space at thousands of miles per hour, was to challenge the most obvious everyday experience. It was like claiming that black was white. Copernicus foresaw the hailstorm of mockery, caricatures, and pamphlets that would rain down on him. He would be called a madman, compared to Lucian's heroes who flew to the moon. And this fear of humiliation, of becoming a public laughingstock, was perhaps more terrifying to him, a serious, respected man accustomed to honor, than the hypothetical threat from the Inquisition. He feared not the pyre for his body, but the pillory for his mind. And it was Rheticus, with his enthusiasm and deep understanding, who first showed him that his theory could evoke not only laughter, but also admiration. He gave Copernicus hope that there were other minds in the world capable of appreciating his truth. But behind this fear of ridicule, like a first line of defense, hid another, much deeper and darker terror, the shadow of the Inquisition. Although in the first half of the 16th century, persecution for scientific ideas had not yet reached the scale it would in Galileo's time, the atmosphere was already extremely tense. The pyre on which Giordano Bruno would be burned in 1600 had not yet been lit, but the smoke from other pyres, where religious heretics were burning, was already drifting across Europe. Copernicus, as a canon, as part of the church system, knew its rules and its power perfectly well. He understood that his work was walking a razor's edge. The problem was not just that his theory contradicted a few lines from the Psalms or the book of Joshua. The problem was deeper. The entire Aristotelian Ptolemaic cosmology had been assimilated and canonized by medieval scholasticism, primarily by Thomas Aquinas. It had become part of official Catholic doctrine. The celestial hierarchy mirrored the ecclesiastical and feudal hierarchy. To challenge the immobility of the earth meant to challenge this unshakable God-ordained order. In a situation where the Reformation had already split half of Germany and Scandinavia from Rome, the Church could not afford to show weakness or allow doubt in the foundations of its teaching. Any challenge could be seen as aiding the enemy. Copernicus likely pondered the fate of freethinkers like John Hus, who was burned a century earlier. He understood that dedicating the book to the Pope, or having the support of a single cardinal, was a weak defense if his work was declared heretical. Moods in Rome could change with the death of one pope and the accession of another, more conservative one. His position as a canon was both a protection and an additional risk. As a servant of the Church, he might not face immediate trial, but he would also be held to a stricter standard if accused of undermining the faith. This fear was not paranoid. It was entirely rational. He lived in an age when one could lose not only one's position, but also one's life for a careless word about religion. And he carried within him knowledge that was not just a careless word, but dynamite planted at the foundation of the entire cosmos. The third layer of his fear was related not to the outside world, but to his own inner demons. And the name of this demon was perfectionism. Copernicus was not so much a philosophical revolutionary as he was a mathematician to the core. For him, the truth of a theory was determined by its mathematical rigor and predictive power. And herein lay one of the main reasons for his delay. His own heliocentric system, for all its conceptual elegance, turned out to be not so simple or perfect in practice. The main problem was that Copernicus, like all astronomers since antiquity, was a prisoner of the dogma of uniform circular motion as the only possible motion for celestial bodies. He could not imagine that planets move in ellipses, or that their speed changes. This would only be discovered by Kepler nearly a century later. And since the real orbits of the planets are elliptical, his model, based on perfect circles, did not perfectly match observational data. To make his system work and reconcile it with the visible motion of the planets, Copernicus, to his great disappointment, had to retain parts of Ptolemy's cumbersome apparatus. He was forced to use epicycles and eccentrics, albeit in smaller numbers than his predecessor. His universe turned out to be not as simple and harmonious as he would have liked. It was better, more logical, but still not perfect. For a man who had undertaken his titanic labor out of an aesthetic disgust for the monstrosity of Ptolemy's system, this was a real tragedy. He could not publish a work that was not absolute mathematical perfection. Every inconsistency, every error in his calculations was a personal defeat for him. He spent decades recalculating his tables, trying to refine the parameters of the orbits, searching for that ideal combination of circular motions that would precisely describe reality. It was a chase for a mathematical grail that could not succeed, because the initial premise of circular orbits was wrong. Thus, his silence was caused not only by fear of the outside world, but also by a deep dissatisfaction with the results of his own work. He was brilliant enough to turn the world upside down, but not enough to solve its final mystery. And this gap between his grand design and its real-world implementation tormented him and prevented him from making the final mark. The fourth, and perhaps most agonizing layer of his fear, lay in the realm of his own identity. Inside Nicolaus Copernicus, a quiet civil war had been raging for his entire adult life. Two men, two entities, whose goals and values were diametrically opposed, fought within him. On one side was the loyal and diligent canon of the Warmia chapter, a doctor of canon law, a respected member of society, an administrator, and a diplomat. This man was part of the system. He valued order, stability, hierarchy, and tradition. He was a deeply devout Catholic who participated in church services, observed fasts, and in his daily life was a pillar of the very church whose foundations his theory undermined. This Copernicus did not want to be a rebel. He did not seek conflict. He wanted to live his life in peace and tranquility, serving God and people to the best of his abilities. But on the other side lived the revolutionary scientist, the brilliant mathematician and astronomer, whose mind refused to accept a lie, even if that lie was sanctified by centuries and authorities. This Copernicus was obsessed with the search for truth. He believed in the power of logic and observation. He saw his work not as an act of destruction, but as an act of higher cognition, as a way to read the Creator's design undistorted by human delusions. He was convinced that by discovering the true structure of the universe, he was not refuting God, but on the contrary, glorifying his greatness and wisdom. And these two personalities were in constant, irresolvable conflict. The canon demanded caution, humility, and obedience. The scientist demanded courage, honesty, and publication. The 30-year silence was the result of this paralyzing internal standoff. To publish the work would mean that Copernicus the scientist had triumphed over Copernicus the canon, which would lead to the collapse of his entire familiar life and identity. And to refuse publication would mean betraying his genius, betraying the truth. He was stuck between two worlds, unable to definitively choose either one. His fear was the fear of a man who does not know who he truly is, a faithful servant of the system or its gravedigger. And finally, behind all these rational and irrational fears, lay something even deeper: the psychological and philosophical burden of his discovery. Copernicus was not just a mathematician. He was a thinker who could not fail to realize the full consequences of his theory. To move the Earth from the center of the universe and send it revolving around the sun along with the other planets was not just a change in an astronomical diagram. It was an act of banishing humanity from its own home. For millennia, man had considered himself the center of creation, the crown of creation, for whom everything was made. This idea gave meaning to existence, comfort in suffering, and served as the basis for morality and religion. Ptolemy's cosmos was cozy and meaningful. The cosmos of Copernicus, although he himself did not yet fully realize it, opened the door to infinity, to a cold and indifferent universe in which the Earth was just one of countless grains of sand. This was the existential dread that Pascal and other thinkers of the modern age would later feel in full. Perhaps Copernicus, having glimpsed into this abyss, was himself frightened by what he had uncovered. He was stripping humanity of its special, privileged status. He was turning our world from a majestic stage into a tiny, spinning ship, lost in a boundless ocean. This was a burden heavy for one man to bear. It is one thing to prove it mathematically, and quite another to accept it philosophically and emotionally. Perhaps his silence was, in part, an unconscious attempt to protect not only himself, but all of humanity from this traumatic truth. He was like a doctor who had given his patient a fatal diagnosis but could not bring himself to say the words, knowing the shock and despair they would cause. He may have felt a colossal responsibility for the chaos, intellectual, religious, and psychological, that his discovery was bound to unleash upon the world. He was Prometheus, about to give humanity not fire, but knowledge capable of incinerating their most cherished illusions. And the weight of this gift was, perhaps, one of the main reasons he hesitated for so long to open his hand. It is important to understand that Copernicus's life was not that of a hermit, dedicated entirely to contemplating the stars. His 30-year silence was conditioned not only by his fears and perfectionism, but also by perfectly mundane, earthly affairs. As a canon of the Warmia chapter, he bore a significant burden of administrative and public duties that constantly distracted him from his main work. He was not a closeted scholar in the modern sense of the term. He was an active participant in the political and economic life of his region. For example, during the war between Poland and the Teutonic Order in the early 1520s, Copernicus effectively served as the administrator of Olsztyn Castle, organizing its defense against the knights. He conducted negotiations, wrote memoranda, and managed church estates ravaged by the war. This required not only time, but also immense nervous strain. Furthermore, Copernicus was a well-known and respected physician. He treated not only his fellow canons and bishops, but also noblemen, and even the Duke of Prussia. Medical practice at that time demanded constant attention and consumed much energy. He also proved himself to be a talented economist. Seeing how the debasement of currency was harming Prussia's economy, he wrote several treatises on monetary reform, in which he formulated the principle later known as the Copernicus-Gresham law. Bad money drives good money out of circulation. He participated in the Prussian Diet, trying to convince the authorities of the need to unify the monetary system. All this intense activity shows us Copernicus not as a timid dreamer, but as a man of action. a pragmatist deeply immersed in the problems of his time. And this gives us another key to understanding his delay. The revolution in astronomy was a matter of immense importance to him, but it was not the only thing in his life. He could not simply lock himself in his tower and forget everything else. His duties to the chapter, his duty to his patients, his concern for the welfare of his homeland, all this was part of his identity and demanded his time and energy. Perhaps he also postponed finishing his work because he was constantly busy with other, more pressing matters. And it was into this complex web of fears, perfectionism, internal conflicts, and daily worries that the young and energetic Georg Joachim Rheticus burst. His arrival was the very push that was so badly needed. Rheticus spent 2 years in Frombork, from 1539 to 1541. And during those 2 years, he acted as both a tempter and an apostle. At first, he was the tempter. With his sincere, unfeigned enthusiasm, his deep understanding of the theory's mathematical subtleties, he slowly melted the ice of distrust and fear in old Copernicus's soul. He became for him the ideal reader that he had dreamed of his entire life. Rheticus did not laugh. He did not accuse him of heresy. He asked the right questions. He admired the elegance of the system. He saw in it not a threat, but the greatest revelation. He restored Copernicus's faith that his work could be understood and accepted. But then Rheticus transformed into an apostle, an active preacher of the new doctrine. He understood that simply persuading Copernicus was useless. Action was needed, and he proposed a brilliant tactical move. Without waiting for the publication of the entire monumental work, he decided to release a trial balloon. With Copernicus's permission, he wrote and, in 1540, published a book in Gdansk titled Narratio Prima, or First Narrative. It was a brief but very clear and enthusiastic presentation of the heliocentric system, written in the form of a letter to his teacher. In it, Rheticus not only explained Copernicus's main ideas, but also emphasized their mathematical advantages and philosophical beauty. He presented Copernicus not as a subversive, but as a great reformer of astronomy, a successor to the work of Ptolemy. Narratio Prima was a success in the scholarly circles of Europe. It generated interest and lively discussion, but it did not provoke a scandal or persecution. This was exactly the reaction one could have hoped for. Rheticus proved to his teacher that the world was not as terrifying as it seemed from his tower window. He showed that there were minds ready to listen and understand. This success became the final and decisive argument in his hands. The success of Rheticus's first narrative was the last drop that overflowed Copernicus's cup of hesitation. The dam of 30 years of silence was breached. The persistent entreaties of the young scholar were joined by the authoritative voice of his old friend, Bishop Tiedemann Giese. Giese, seeing that Copernicus was now old and weak, and that his great work still lay in manuscript form, increased his pressure. He appealed to his duty to science, to God, who had given him such an outstanding mind, and to posterity. He argued that to hide such an important truth was a sin, comparable to burying one's talent in the ground from the biblical parable. The combined pressure of the two people closest to him, the young and ardent Rheticus and the old and wise Giese, finally broke Copernicus's resistance. Fear gave way to the realization of the inevitable. He understood that if he did not publish his work now, it would likely never be published. He had already done everything he could. The system was built, the calculations complete. Further delay was meaningless. It was tantamount to the destruction of his life's work. At that moment, he probably felt not only fear, but also immense relief. The burden he had carried alone for decades could now be shared with the world. He finally decided to release his intellectual child from the tower into freedom, allowing it to live its own life. He agreed to hand over the complete manuscript of On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres to Rheticus for preparation for printing. This was his final decision, his surrender to the insistence of his friends and the passage of time. The Great Revolution, so long maturing in silence and secrecy, was finally to become the property of humanity. But even in taking this last step, Copernicus did not abandon his attempts to protect himself and his creation. Having decided to publish, Copernicus and his friends immediately began to think of ways to minimize the risks, and they developed a brilliant defensive strategy, the true masterpiece of which was the book's dedication. Copernicus decided to dedicate his work not just to anyone, but to the most powerful man in the Christian world, the reigning Pope, Paul III. This was a brilliant and multi-layered political move. First, it was an act of demonstrative loyalty. By dedicating the book to the Pope, Canon Copernicus was, in effect, saying, "I am not a rebel or a heretic. I am your faithful servant, and I present the fruits of my labor for your judgment as the highest authority on earth." This immediately pulled the rug out from under potential accusers among the lower church ranks. Criticizing a book dedicated to the Pope was much more difficult and dangerous. Second, in the text of the dedication itself, which became the famous preface to the book, Copernicus directly addressed his fears and explained them. He honestly admitted that he feared ridicule and presented his work not as an assertion of physical reality, but as a hypothesis intended for mathematicians. Mathematics is written for mathematicians. He humbly noted that he had undertaken his work because astronomers could not agree on their calculations, and he merely wished to offer a more harmonious and consistent model. Third, he found a very compelling and pragmatic reason for his work: the need to reform the church calendar. This problem had long been known and discussed within the church. By presenting his book as a tool for solving this pressing practical task, he moved it from the category of dangerous metaphysics to the category of useful, applied science. He was, in effect, telling the Pope, "My system may look strange, but it works, and it can do the church a great service." This shield, forged from flattery, humility, and pragmatism, was intended to protect his Achilles' heel, the revolutionary essence of his discovery. He was trying to smuggle in his revolution disguised as a modest technical improvement. And so, the moment arrived that Copernicus had awaited and feared for nearly 40 years. In 1541, after 2 years of persuasion and joint work, Georg Joachim Rheticus left Frombork. He carried with him the most precious treasure of the old astronomer's life, the complete and final manuscript of the treatise On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. This was the point of no return. As long as the manuscript remained in his tower, Copernicus was still its absolute master. He could rewrite it, correct it, or even burn it at any moment. But from the minute it left his hands, he lost all control over it. His idea, his secret, his fear, all of it now embarked on a long journey into the noisy and unpredictable world. The fate of his creation now depended on other people, on Rheticus, on publishers, on printers, and ultimately, on readers. For Copernicus, this must have been a moment of profound inner turmoil. On the one hand, he felt relief that his life's work would not be lost. On the other, he was gripped by terror at the irreversibility of the step he had taken. He had released the genie from the bottle. Rheticus first took the manuscript to Wittenberg, but the local printers did not dare take on such a complex and potentially scandalous work. He then traveled to Nuremberg, one of the largest centers of printing in Europe. There, he found a publisher, Johann Petraeus, and entrusted the supervision of the printing to a trusted colleague, the Lutheran theologian and humanist Andreas Osiander. Copernicus, hundreds of miles away in his Frombork Tower, could only wait and pray. He was already old and sick. He understood perfectly well that he would most likely not live to see the world's reaction to his work. He had made his move in the great chess game with history, but he was not destined to know the results of that game. He had sent his message into the future, and all that was left for him was to await death in the same tower where that message was written. And here, at the very last stage, history took another ironic and paradoxical turn. When the book was already at the print shop in Nuremberg, Andreas Osiander, the theologian whom Rheticus had entrusted with overseeing the printing, committed an act of incredible intellectual audacity and perhaps betrayal. Osiander, being a cautious man himself and understanding perfectly well what a scandal the book could cause, decided to play it safe. Without the knowledge or permission of Copernicus, and most likely Rheticus, he wrote and inserted an anonymous preface into the book titled, "To the Reader on the Hypotheses of this Work." In this preface, he claimed that the author was not at all insisting that his heliocentric system was a description of physical reality. No, it was merely a hypothesis, a convenient mathematical device, a fiction created solely to simplify calculations and predict the positions of the planets more accurately. He wrote that an astronomer does not need to seek true causes. It is enough for him to invent a model that agrees with the observations. In this way, Osiander effectively neutered the entire revolutionary essence of Copernicus's work. He turned the greatest discovery about the real structure of the world into a simple mental exercise, a harmless mathematical toy. This was the last, most sophisticated form of concealment, carried out by another's hands. When Copernicus's friends, Gysi and Rheticus, saw the printed book with this anonymous preface, they were furious. Gysi wrote a letter to the Nuremberg City Council demanding the text be removed, but it was too late. The entire print run was finished. The irony of fate was truly devilish. The man who had hidden his work for 30 years out of fear finally saw it published, only to have it hidden once more, covered by the fig leaf of hypothesis. His revolution was presented to the world as a modest reform. And this shield, invented by Osiander, did indeed save the book from serious attacks for a long time. It was read as a useful mathematical reference, while its physical meaning was ignored. But the price of this salvation was high, the distortion of the author's own intent. The death of Copernicus is shrouded in legend, but the most famous of them, even if not documentarily accurate, possesses the deepest symbolic truth. At the end of 1542, just as his work was being printed in Nuremberg, Copernicus suffered an apoplectic stroke. He was paralyzed on his right side and fell into a coma. For several months he lay between life and death. His mind faded, and he could no longer speak or comprehend what was happening. Meanwhile, a messenger from Nuremberg was already carrying the first copy of the printed book to Frombork. According to the story passed down by Tiedemann Gysi, the messenger arrived on May 24, 1543. On that very day, Copernicus briefly emerged from his coma. His friends placed the book, the fruit of his entire agonizing and great life, into his limp hands. And legend holds that he opened his eyes, saw and touched his creation, after which his consciousness faded once more, and he breathed his last. He died on the same day that his immortal work saw the light. This ending closes the composition of his life with perfect dramatic symmetry. He who had so feared the world's judgment was spared from it. He heard neither the ridicule nor the praise. He saw neither the fury of theologians nor the enthusiasm of his few followers. He had accomplished his revolution and left the stage at the very moment the curtain rose. He had stopped the sun and moved the earth, but he did it so quietly that he himself barely had time to hear the first chord of that new music of the spheres which he had written for humanity. His personal journey, full of fear, doubt, and solitude, was over. But the journey of his book, his idea, was just beginning. He passed the baton to future generations, leaving them an inheritance of not only a new universe, but also the eternal question of the price of knowledge and the courage required to obtain it. Immediately after its publication, Copernicus's book did not have the effect of an exploding bomb. The echo of his intellectual blast was initially quiet, almost imperceptible. There were several reasons for this. First, Osiander's preface did its job, presenting the book as a purely hypothetical exercise and lulling the vigilance of church censors. Second, the work on the revolutions was incredibly difficult to understand. It was written in Latin and filled with highly complex mathematical proofs and tables. Only a few dozen professional astronomers in all of Europe could read, and more importantly, understand it. To everyone else, it was just an incomprehensible and strange book. But the seeds had been sown in fertile ground. Slowly, over the decades, Copernicus's ideas began to sprout. They were first taken up by astronomers who saw his system as a powerful tool for calculations. But the real explosion occurred at the turn of the 16th and 17th centuries. The Italian philosopher Giordano Bruno went much further than Copernicus. He not only accepted heliocentrism as a physical reality, but also proclaimed the infinity of the universe and the multiplicity of worlds, for which he was burned at the stake by the Inquisition in Rome in 1600. Then, the German astronomer Johannes Kepler, working with the precise observations of Tycho Brahe, was able to correct the main flaw in Copernicus's system. He discovered that planets move not in circles, but in ellipses, and he formulated the laws of their motion, giving heliocentrism the mathematical rigor that Copernicus could only dream of. But the main hero of the next act of this drama was Galileo Galilei. Armed with a telescope, he obtained irrefutable proof of Copernicus's correctness. He saw the phases of Venus, the moons of Jupiter, the mountains on the moon. Galileo, unlike the cautious Copernicus, was a brilliant polemicist and popularizer. He did not just prove it. He threw down a challenge to the entire old system, and he took upon himself the full fury of the storm that Copernicus had so feared. The trial of Galileo in 1633 and his recantation became the climax of the conflict between the new science and the old faith. But it was already too late. The genie could not be forced back into the bottle. The echo born in the silence of the Frombork Tower had turned into a thunderclap that shattered the crystal spheres and forever changed humanity's place in the universe. So why did he wait? Why did Nicolaus Copernicus, the man who unleashed arguably the most significant intellectual revolution in human history, hide his life's work from the world for 30 years? Now, having walked his entire path, we can assemble all the pieces of this complex puzzle. The solution to this great paradox is that Copernicus was a revolutionary against his will. He was a man of transition, standing with one foot in the Middle Ages and the other in the modern era. He was not a coward in the simple sense of the word. A man who organizes the defense of a castle against superior forces cannot be a coward. But he was an immeasurably cautious and non-confrontational man who valued peace and order above all else. His silence was the product of a unique and multi-layered alloy of different factors. He was a perfectionist who could not show the world what he considered an imperfect work. He was a scholar who was terrified of ridicule and humiliation from his colleagues. He was a pragmatist who lived in the dangerous era of the Reformation and was well aware of the risks. He was a faithful son of the Church who did not want to become a heretic and destroy the world he served. He was a deep thinker who perhaps was himself frightened by the philosophical consequences of his discovery. He was, finally, a busy administrator who could not always dedicate himself to the stars. He was a revolutionary in a canon's robes. He did not want to be the Martin Luther of science. He did not seek to lead crowds. He wanted only one thing: to correct an error, to restore harmony, to read the true design of God. His ideal was a quiet, almost unheard revolution, carried out in the minds of a select few. He moved the earth, but he wanted to do it so gently that no one would feel the jolt. And in this desire to reconcile the irreconcilable, the radical nature of his discovery and the conservatism of his method, lies the main reason for his 30-year silence, his great drama, and his enduring greatness. The story of Nicolaus Copernicus is far more than just the story of one astronomical discovery. It is an eternal parable about the birth of a new, frightening, and great truth in an old world unready for it. It is a story of the agonizing and lonely process of creation, of the abyss of doubt, fear, and hope that everyone who dares to think differently must cross. Copernicus's fate shows us that the most destructive and creative force in history is not the armies of conquerors or the gold of empires, but a single idea whose time has come. But it also shows what an exorbitant price that idea can demand of its creator. Copernicus lived his life in the shadow of his own discovery, in constant fear of the very world he was destined to change. He is a tragic figure, a genius who, until the end of his days, could never fully reconcile himself with his own greatness. His story poses eternal questions to us. What is more important, the purity of truth or the peace of society? What is the scientist's responsibility to humanity? And what is a person willing to endure for the sake of knowledge, not only in the fight against the outside world, but in the fight against himself? Copernicus did not provide the answers. He merely posed the questions with unprecedented sharpness. He taught us not only that the earth revolves around the sun, he taught us that the path to the stars often lies through long years of silence, loneliness, and fear, and that sometimes, to move the world, one must first, for a lifetime, stand motionless, in the silence of one's tower, gazing into the eternal and silent truth of the night sky.